My son told me to leave his party. So I smiled, picked up the folder, and walked out. The next morning, he called me 42 times. I had been sitting in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I finally got out of the truck. The building looked nothing like it did when it was a failing print shop. Marcus had gutted it, refinished everything, installed floor-to-ceiling windows along the front face. The new sign above the entrance, Callaway Tech Solutions, was backlit in blue, clean and sharp against the October sky. I had paid for that sign. I had paid for most of what was inside too, but I wasn't thinking about that as I straightened my jacket and pulled the manila folder from the passenger seat. The folder was thick. $340,000 worth of promissory notes, co-signed business loans, and personal checks I had written over the past 4 years sat inside it, documented and notarized. I hadn't planned to bring it tonight. Then my daughter called me that afternoon and said, "Dad, just be careful. Something feels off about this party." So I grabbed the folder. I walked through the glass doors into a room full of people I didn't know. I counted maybe 80 guests, maybe more. Catering staff moved between clusters of people in expensive clothes, carrying trays of something that smelled like shrimp and something else I couldn't name. A jazz trio was set up in the far corner. Everything gleamed. Marcus was near the center of the room when I spotted him. He was wearing a dark suit I'd never seen before, a pocket square that probably cost more than my first car payment, and the kind of easy confidence that only comes when you've decided tonight is about you. My daughter-in-law Vanessa stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her smile the practiced kind. I raised a hand when his eyes landed on me. He looked away. I made my way across the room. "Marcus." I reached out for the handshake we'd always done, my hand extended. "Congratulations. This place looks incredible." He glanced at my hand, then at Vanessa. Something passed between them. "Dad." His voice was low and clipped. "I didn't think you'd actually wear that." I looked down. I was wearing a dark gray sport coat, pressed slacks, good shoes, the same outfit I'd worn to my own retirement dinner 3 years ago. "What's wrong with this?" "Nothing." He said it the way people say nothing when they mean everything. Vanessa had already turned away to greet someone else. I found a seat near the edge of the room, close to a high table with a small centerpiece. A woman I didn't recognize nodded at me politely and moved away. I set the folder in my lap and watched my son work the room. He was good at it. I'd always been proud of that. He had his mother's ease with people, her ability to make whoever she was talking to feel like the only person in the room. Ellen had been gone for 6 years now, and sometimes watching Marcus move through a crowd was the closest thing I had to seeing her again. An hour passed. The food came around. I took a plate and ate slowly, watching. A man I later learned was a venture capital contact gave a short speech about Marcus's vision and leadership. Marcus responded with remarks that were polished and warm and mentioned his wife twice, his team 3 times, and his father 0 times. I told myself it didn't matter. Then Marcus tapped the microphone again. He was doing a second round of acknowledgments, thanking specific people by name, business partners, mentors he'd found on his own, a former professor who had believed in him, a friend who had loaned him office space. Not one word about the man who had co-signed the original business loan when no bank would touch him. Not one word about the person who had written check after check when the first 2 product launches failed. Not one word about the 43-year-old contractor who had spent his weekends helping gut and rebuild this very room. I sat with that for a moment. Then I picked up the folder and walked toward the front of the room where Marcus was still holding the microphone. "Dad." His voice had an edge now, the kind that's meant to stop you without making a scene. "This isn't the time. I just wanted to say congratulations in person," I said. His jaw tightened. I need you to not do this right now. You're making it weird." "Making what weird?" Vanessa appeared from my left. She touched my elbow, her fingers firm. "Richard," she said, and the way she said my name made it feel like a warning. "Why don't you go get yourself a drink at the bar? We'll catch up later." "I've been here an hour and a half," I said. "Yes, and we appreciate you coming." She was steering me by the elbow now, actually moving me, and the people nearby were starting to look. "But Marcus has some important guests tonight, and we really need him focused. You understand." Marcus said nothing. He was watching me with an expression I recognized and hated, the same look he'd given me at 15 when his friends were over, and I said something he considered embarrassing, like I was a problem to be managed. "Got it," I said. I stopped moving. Vanessa's hand fell away from my elbow. I looked at my son for 3 full seconds, long enough that he couldn't pretend I hadn't. Then I opened the folder and pulled out the top document, the original co-signed loan agreement from 4 years ago, $180,000, my signature at the bottom beside his. "Then you definitely won't be needing me to keep covering this," I said. I folded it once and set it on the high table beside the centerpiece. Then I folded the second document, the personal check records, and placed it on top. Then the third. "Dad, what are you?" "Enjoy your party, Marcus." I picked up the empty folder, which was now just a sleeve, and tucked it under my arm. "It's a beautiful room." I walked out through the glass doors. The night air was cold and clean. I sat in my truck for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel and didn't feel much of anything except tired. Then I started the engine and drove home. I live alone in a 3-bedroom house in Greensboro, North Carolina, the same house Ellen and I bought in 1987. Marcus grew up in this house. So did my daughter Claire, who lives 40 minutes away in Burlington and calls me every Sunday without fail. I had planned to eventually leave the house to both of them equally, though that plan had always been more of a thought than a document. I fed the dog, made a cup of tea, and sat in the kitchen with the lights low. The folder was on the table in front of me, empty. I stared at the grain of the wood and thought about what I had actually just done. The phone lit up at 11:47 p.m., Marcus's name. I watched it ring, then it stopped, and 2 minutes later it lit up again. I turned it face down and went to bed. In the morning there were 14 missed calls. I made breakfast, let the dog out, and called Claire. "I heard," she said before I could start. "Vanessa texted me at midnight. She said you made a scene at the party and upset Marcus." "What kind of scene?" "She said you walked up while he was speaking and started waving documents around." I told Claire what actually happened. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "He didn't mention you at all?" she said. "Not once." Another silence. "Dad, he's going to call this your fault. You know that, right?" "He already is." "What are you going to do?" I looked at the folder on the kitchen table. "I'm going to talk to someone." I had a lawyer in mind, a man named Gerald Ferris, who had handled Ellen's estate and a property dispute I'd had with a neighbor 7 years ago. Gerald was methodical and unhurried and spoke plainly, which I appreciated. I called his office that morning and left a message. He called back within the hour. "Come in Thursday," he said. "We'll figure out what you've got." I spent the 2 days before that appointment going through my files. I found everything. The original loan co-signature from 2019. The 4 personal checks I'd written in 2020 when the first product launch went sideways, $8,000, $12,000, $15,000, and $9,000. The contractor receipts from the renovation work. The $47,000 I'd put in as what Marcus had called an informal investment, and what I was now thinking of more carefully. I put it all in a new folder, organized by date with totals written in the margin. The figure at the bottom was $340,200. Marcus called 11 more times across those 2 days. I let everyone go to voicemail. I didn't listen to the messages. On Thursday morning, I drove downtown and sat across from Gerald in his office. He reviewed the documents with the kind of focused quiet I remembered from the estate work. When he was done, he set them on the desk and looked at me. "The co-signed loan is interesting," he said. "You're not the primary borrower, but you're liable. Do you want to formally pursue recovery, or is this more about getting clarity on where you stand?" "Both," I said. "The personal checks are trickier without a written loan agreement. Did he ever acknowledge them as loans rather than gifts?" "In texts, yes. I have them. He said, 'I'll pay you back when we're profitable,' more than once." Gerald nodded. "Pull those. They help." He tapped the contractor receipts. "These are yours outright regardless. You performed work on a commercial property. Even informal labor agreements can be quantified." He leaned back slightly. "Richard, the total here is significant. What outcome are you actually looking for? I thought about it. I want him to understand that what I've given him isn't free, that it has weight. That's a different goal than recovering the money. I know, but I want to do both. Gerald wrote something in his notepad. Give me a week. I'll put together a demand letter, and we'll see how he responds. That'll tell us a lot about what comes next. I drove home in the early afternoon, passing the exit for Burlington without turning off. Claire had offered to meet me for lunch, but I'd told her I needed to handle this part alone. She understood. She'd always understood that about me, even when Marcus didn't. The demand letter went out the following Friday by certified mail and email. Gerald had written it in the precise, bloodless language that legal documents use: outstanding obligations, informal agreements evidenced by written communication, requested accounting of funds advanced. It didn't threaten anything outright. It just made the number visible: $340,200. I was in the garage reorganizing storage bins when Marcus called on Saturday morning, this time from a number I didn't recognize. I answered before I realized. Did you actually hire a lawyer? His voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, and I'd caught him lying about where he'd been. To send me a letter? Like I'm some dad. What is wrong with you? Good morning, Marcus. Don't do that. Don't be calm like this is normal. You walked out of my party and now you're sending me legal documents. Do you understand how insane that looks? I understand it looks inconvenient. It looks like you're trying to destroy what I've built. I set down the bin I was holding. What you built, I said. Let's talk about what you built. Here we go. I co-signed a loan that you needed because your credit wasn't strong enough to get it alone. I wrote you 4 checks in 2020 when your product failed. You told me you'd pay me back when you were profitable. Is the company profitable now, Marcus? Silence. The renovation on that building. I gave up 8 weekends. I drove 3 hours each way. I never asked you for a thing in return, except to be treated like I belonged in the room I helped build. My voice stayed even. I had decided before this call that I wasn't going to raise it. Last Tuesday, your wife walked me to the bar by my elbow, like I was someone who'd wandered in off the street. Vanessa was just trying to. I don't need you to explain Vanessa to me. I need you to understand what you owe me, not just the money, the basic human decency. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less sharp, more careful. I'll send you something. A number. We can make a payment arrangement. I'm not interested in a payment arrangement. I'm interested in whether you understand what happened. I understand you're upset. That's not the same thing. Dad, I have 40 employees and 3 investors who all saw you walk up to me mid-speech with a stack of papers. Do you know what that looked like? Do you care what that did to my credibility? I almost laughed. Your credibility. I picked up the storage bin again. Get the letter to Gerald. He'll handle the rest. I hung up. The garage was quiet except for the sound of a lawnmower 2 houses down. I stood there for a minute just breathing. Then I went back to the bins. Claire drove up that evening unannounced, which she almost never did. She brought takeout from the Thai place in Burlington that I liked, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we used to when the kids were teenagers and something needed to be talked through. He called me, she said. She was pulling apart a spring roll without eating it. He said you're trying to bankrupt him. I sent a letter documenting what he owes me. That's not what he said. I know it's not. She looked up from the spring roll. What's actually happening, Dad? Like, underneath all of it? I took a long breath. I spent 6 years after your mother died making myself smaller so I wouldn't be in the way. I stopped having opinions about things. I stopped asking for things. I figured out how to be useful without being present. I looked at the table. I gave Marcus everything he asked for, because it felt like the last useful thing I could do. And at that party I realized he had decided that I was just a resource. Not a person, a resource. Claire was quiet. He didn't say my name once, I said. Not once in front of all those people. I was in that room for an hour and a half, and I was invisible to him. The only time he noticed me was when I became inconvenient. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. What do you need from me? Nothing. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who loves me. She stayed for 2 hours, and we talked about everything except Marcus. When she left, she hugged me for a long time in the doorway. I watched her taillights until they disappeared around the corner, and then I went inside and felt something shift in my chest. Not better, not worse, just different. Like something that had been held in place for years was finally moving. I hadn't updated my will since Ellen died. I knew that. Gerald had mentioned it both times I'd worked with him. It was one of those things I kept putting off because doing it felt like admitting I was closer to the end than the middle. And after Ellen died, I was in no state to think clearly about any of it. I called Gerald on Monday morning. "I need to update my estate documents," I said. "All of it." "I was wondering when you'd get to that," he said, with the gentle tone of a man who had been waiting patiently. "Come in Wednesday." I spent Tuesday evening going through the numbers. The house was worth somewhere between $380,000 and $420,000, depending on the market. I had a retirement account, an investment portfolio, a second property in Asheville I'd bought as a rental 15 years ago that was now worth considerably more than I'd paid for it. Add it all together, and the figure was somewhere north of $1.2 million. Not a fortune, but not nothing. 4 decades of work. I sat with a legal pad and wrote out what felt right. Not what was expected. What was right. Gerald walked me through everything on Wednesday afternoon. When I was done talking, he looked at his notes, looked at me, and nodded once. "This is going to create conflict," he said. "It already has. The Asheville property specifically. If you leave it to Claire and put Marcus's share in a conditional trust, he'll challenge it. Let him try. It's my property. I earned it." Gerald wrote for a moment. "And the house?" I thought about Claire, who had called me every Sunday for 6 years, who had shown up the previous Saturday with Thai food because she could tell I needed someone to sit across from, who had never once asked me for money, and never once made me feel like a problem to be managed. "Equally," I said, "but I want it structured so his share only releases under certain conditions." "Conditions being?" "He settles the outstanding amount first. And he does it in writing, with an acknowledgement of the original nature of those payments. Not as gifts, as loans." Gerald wrote it down. "And if he doesn't, then his share goes to a scholarship fund. I'll name it after Ellen." Gerald looked up. Something in his expression softened slightly. "The Ellen Morse Scholarship Fund. That's a strong name." "She was a teacher for 31 years, I said. Seemed right. I signed the new documents 11 days later in Gerald's conference room, with his paralegal and a notary as witnesses. As I signed each page, I felt calmer than I had in months, maybe years. There's something clarifying about putting things in writing. It takes them out of the air, where they can be distorted and argued over, and makes them real. Marcus had responded to Gerald's demand letter through a lawyer of his own, a man named Barrett, who sent a 2-page letter using words like charitable advancement and familial gift to describe $340,000 in documented loans. I read it twice, set it down, and called Gerald. "He's claiming the money was a gift," I said. "I know. His lawyer is good. This is a standard opening position. We have the texts." "We do. They'll try to contextualize them. Informal language, aspirational statement, etc." Gerald paused. "Richard, I want to be direct with you. Litigation is expensive and slow, and it would put both of you through a very public and unpleasant process. What's your actual priority?" I thought about it honestly. I want him to have to say, out loud, in a signed document, that the money was a loan, not to get rich, not to hurt him. I want the record to exist. That's a mediation goal, not a litigation goal. Then let's do mediation. Gerald arranged it within 3 weeks. A neutral mediator, a conference room downtown, both lawyers present. Marcus arrived with Vanessa, which I hadn't expected. She sat next to him in a tailored blazer and didn't make eye contact with me when I walked in. The mediator was a woman named Dr. Patricia Holcomb, who had a calm authority that reminded me of the good teachers I'd had in school, the ones who could manage a room without raising their voice. She opened by explaining the process. Both sides would have time to speak. Nothing said in mediation could be used in subsequent litigation. The goal was a mutually agreeable resolution. Marcus spoke first. He was composed in the way I'd seen him be composed at the party, the practiced version of himself. He described the money as family support given freely over difficult years. He described the renovation work as something I had offered to do without being asked. He described the situation as his father being unable to accept that he had grown into his own success. I listened without expression. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't reach for anger. I described each transaction by date and amount and context. I read aloud the texts where Marcus had specifically said loan, and I'll pay you back. I described the renovation weekends, methodically dates, hours, specific work performed. I described the party without editorializing what was said, what was not said, what happened when I approached the front of the room. Then I said one more thing which I had thought about carefully on the drive over. I'm not here because I need the money. I'm here because my son decided that the version of me that's useful, the one who co-signs loans and writes checks and drives 3 hours to swing a hammer, is a different person from the one he's embarrassed to have in the room. I want him to understand that those are the same person, and I want a document that says so. Vanessa looked at her hands. Marcus looked at the table. Dr. Holcomb back. A batter Holcomb looked at me steadily and nodded once. The mediation ran for 4 hours. By the end, Marcus's lawyer had agreed to a repayment schedule, $180,000 over 3 years, beginning 60 days from signing, and a written acknowledgement, carefully worded but unambiguous, that the personal advances had constituted informal loans with the expectation of repayment, not gifts. Marcus signed it without looking at me. Vanessa signed as a witness. I signed my copy and stood up. Dr. Holcomb thanked everyone. Gerald shook Barrett's hand. Marcus put on his coat without turning around. Marcus, I said. He stopped but didn't turn all the way. I'm proud of what you built. I want you to know that. He stood with his back half toward me for a moment. Then he walked out. Vanessa followed. Gerald put his hand briefly on my shoulder as we left the building. In the parking lot, the November wind had teeth in it. I sat in my truck and looked at the signed copy of the acknowledgement in Gerald's folder on the passenger seat. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in the way that comes after something long and difficult is finally finished. I had dinner with Claire that Friday. She'd picked a place in Burlington she knew I liked, a steakhouse that had been there since we first moved to North Carolina, the kind of place that doesn't change its menu and doesn't need to. We sat in a corner booth and I told her everything. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Now, I figure out what I actually want the next part of my life to look like. What does that mean practically? I cut a piece of steak and thought about it. I've been in this holding pattern since your mother died, working on things for other people, driving to Marcus's projects, waiting for the family dinners that stopped happening. I've been useful, but I've been invisible, and I let that happen. I set down the fork. I want to stop letting that happen. She looked at me across the table. Dad, what are you going to do? I called a real estate agent about the Asheville property. Not to sell it, to renovate it. Actually renovate it properly this time, the way I always meant to. And I've been thinking about that housing project idea. You know the empty lot on Cone Boulevard, near where the old furniture warehouse was? She nodded slowly. There's a nonprofit doing affordable senior housing initiatives in Guilford County. I met the director at a chamber event 2 years ago. I called him last week. He's been looking for someone with construction experience to consult on a project. I picked up the fork again. Turns out, being a 40-year contractor is actually useful somewhere. She smiled. The first full smile I'd seen from her in weeks. Mom would have loved that. I know she would. We stayed at the table for almost 2 hours, talking about things that had nothing to do with Marcus. Her job, which she liked but was thinking about leaving. A man she'd been seeing for 3 months and hadn't mentioned yet, which told me it was serious. A trip she wanted to take in the spring, Portugal maybe, or Spain. I drove home with the windows down a little despite the cold, and the dog met me at the door, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment doing nothing but being in my own house and feeling like it was mine. 2 weeks later, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. Then I realized I'd blocked Marcus's regular number. I read it twice before responding. Dad, I heard you're doing the housing project with Gil Forrester. He mentioned you at a meeting I was at. People think highly of you. I thought you should know that. I put the phone down and made coffee and thought about what to write back. I wrote 3 different versions, deleted them all, and finally landed on 6 words. Thank you for telling me that. His response came 4 minutes later. I've been thinking about what you said at mediation, about the same person. I don't have the right words yet, but I think I understand what you meant. I read it 3 times. I thought about Ellen, who had always believed that people could grow if you gave them the space and the reason to. I thought about whether this was growth or strategy. I wasn't sure it was possible to know yet. That's a start, I wrote back. I didn't hear from him for another 3 weeks. Then a check arrived by certified mail, the first installment of the repayment schedule, exactly the agreed amount, on time. No note, no card, just the check. I deposited it and put the record in the file I kept for this purpose. Gil Forrester's organization was called Piedmont Housing Forward, and the project was a 24-unit development on a parcel near downtown Greensboro, designed specifically for residents over 65 with fixed incomes. I came on as a volunteer construction consultant, which meant I attended planning meetings and walked the site and told the architects when something was going to cost 3 times what they thought it would and why. It was the most engaged I'd felt in years. At the first site meeting, Gil introduced me to the group and mentioned my background. One of the younger architects, a woman named Deja, who couldn't have been 30, looked at me with the kind of frank assessment that young professionals give to older ones when they're trying to figure out if the experience is real. "How long in residential construction?" she asked. 37 years. 20 as my own contractor. Commercial too? Some. More recently. She nodded and turned back to the blueprints. But she started directing questions to me after that, and by the end of the meeting we were deep in a conversation about foundation drainage that everyone else had tuned out. On the drive home, I was still thinking through the problem, and I realized I was looking forward to Thursday's follow-up meeting in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. I called Claire on Sunday, as usual. She asked how the project was going, and I talked for 20 minutes without stopping, which is not something I normally do. She laughed and said, "I sounded like a different person." "I feel like a different person," I said. "Good different?" "Yeah," I said. "Good different." The Asheville renovation was moving too. Slower than I wanted, but steadily. I had hired a local contractor I trusted and was driving up every other week to check progress. The property was a 1960s ranch house with good bones that had been rented for 15 years and needed serious updating. I was putting real money into it, the kind of money you don't spend unless you're committed to keeping something. My plan was to keep it, not rent it out, not sell it, use it. A place to go when I needed to be somewhere else, somewhere that had nothing to do with the version of my life in Greensboro. Ellen had loved Asheville. We'd talked about retiring there. Another plan that got overtaken by events. I drove up one October weekend and spent 2 days walking the renovation in progress, making notes, talking through the kitchen layout with the contractor. On Saturday evening, I sat on the back porch with a beer and watched the last of the light leave the sky over the mountains and felt something I can only describe as peace. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than that. The absence of the low-grade tension I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it was like not to have it. I thought about Marcus. I thought about the party, the folder, the mediation. I thought about the moment I had walked out through those glass doors and sat in my truck and felt old and invisible. I thought about what it had taken to stop feeling that way. It hadn't been one thing. It hadn't been the letter or the mediation or the will. It had been the decision, which came first and made everything else possible. The decision to stop making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Ellen had known that about me. She'd told me more than once, in her gentle, direct way, that I gave too much and asked for too little, and one day that imbalance would cost me something. I'd always thought she meant money. Turns out she meant something harder to replace. On Sunday morning, I drove back to Greensboro, with the windows down and the radio on, something I hadn't done in years. My phone buzzed somewhere near Charlotte, a text from Marcus asking if I was free for a call sometime this week. I waited until I was home, and the dog was fed, and I had a cup of coffee before I responded. "Wednesday evening works," I wrote. "After 7. "Okay," he wrote back. "Thanks." I put the phone in my pocket and went to my desk, where the Piedmont Housing Forward blueprints were spread across the surface. Deja had sent a revised drainage proposal that I wanted to look over before the Thursday meeting. I sat down and got to work. Wednesday arrived, and Marcus called at 7:08, which meant he was nervous. I'd always been able to tell with him. "Hey," he said. "Hey," a pause. "How's the housing project going?" "Really well. We broke ground last week." "That's great. That's really great, Dad." He sounded like he meant it. I actually mentioned it to one of my investors. Turns out his mother is on a fixed income and looking for exactly that kind of place. I don't know if that's useful information. It might be. I'll mention it to Gil. Another pause. This was the dance moving around the thing that needed to be said. I've been in therapy, Marcus said, since about August. Vanessa and I both have been, not just together separately too. He stopped. I'm not saying that to get credit. I'm saying it because it's relevant to what I want to tell you. Okay. I've been thinking a lot about why I did what I did at the party. Not just the party. Before that too. For a few years, honestly. His voice was careful, like he was reading from something he'd written. I think I was ashamed of where I started. Not of you, but of the help I needed. Like if people saw how much you'd helped me, they'd think I hadn't actually done it myself. And so I made you smaller, so I could feel bigger. And that was wrong. I was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to say than most people manage, I said. It took a few months of therapy to get there. I know. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for the party. I'm sorry for the years before it, where I made you feel like a footnote. You're not a footnote. I took a breath. Outside the window, the neighborhood was dark and quiet. The dog was asleep on the floor beside the desk. The Asheville blueprints were still on the surface in front of me. I accept the apology, I said. I want you to know that. But I also need you to know that the apology is the beginning of something, not the end of it. Trust takes time. I know. I'm not closing a door. I'm telling you the door is cracked, not open. That's fair. And Marcus, the second payment is due in March. On time. Without me having to ask. A short silence. It'll be there. Good. We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked about the Asheville property. I asked about the business. He mentioned a new contract. Something with a hospital network in Charlotte, which sounded like genuine progress. I didn't tell him I was proud of him, because it was too soon for that, and it would have sounded like I was forgiving more than I was. But I thought it. After we hung up, I sat for a while with the coffee cooling in my hand. 6 months ago, I had been invisible in a room I helped build. Now, I was consulting on a housing project that would house 48 people who needed somewhere to land. I had an Asheville property being restored to something worth keeping. I had a daughter who called every Sunday and showed up with Thai food when I needed it. I had a signed acknowledgement in a legal folder that said the record exists, that the wait was real, that I wasn't a footnote. And I had, for the first time in 6 years, a life that felt like mine. The housing project held its official groundbreaking ceremony on a cold November morning, a small gathering of city officials and community members, and the project team. Gil asked me to say a few words. I'm not a speech person, but I stood there with the wind coming off the field and said what I actually thought, that housing is dignity, and that dignity is what people deserve at the end of a life of work, and that I hoped every person who eventually lived in these units felt that. Afterward, Deja handed me a coffee from the catering table and said without preamble, "You're going to stay on for Phase 2, right?" Nobody's asked me about Phase 2. I'm asking. I took the coffee. Behind her, the empty lot was marked out with surveying flags, the bare bones of something that would eventually be real and solid and useful. Yeah, I said. I'll stay on. She nodded like that was settled and went back to talking to the architect. I stood there for another minute in the cold, just looking at the flags in the ground, thinking about what gets built and what gets left behind and what the difference is between them. Before you go, if you've been watching along, leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are, and if this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe to Shadow Vengeance. There's a new story ready for you on the left.